You're like a brother to me, she said for years, so I brought her to meet my new girlfriend. Now she's the one begging for a crumb of my attention, and I just call her sis. She called me brother, and that one word ripped through me like a shrapnel wound. I didn't know then that it was just the first shot fired in a war for my own life, and the battle was already about to explode. My name is Liam Davis, 27, living in Denver. For years, I truly believed being Chloe Miller's brother was enough. Enough to quiet the gnawing loneliness, enough to make the world feel less empty. But I was so wrong. It took another woman walking into my life to finally show me how deep that illusion ran. I met Chloe freshman year of college. Both of us were late for philosophy, clutching coffees like shields. She bumped into me so hard the lid popped off, splashing over my notes. Instead of apologizing, she just laughed and said, "Guess the universe didn't want you to learn about Plato today." I laughed too, because how do you stay mad at someone whose smile looks like an inside joke you're already part of? From that moment, she became gravity. We did group projects, late-night diner runs, bad poetry readings, everything two broke students do to pretend life is under control. When she called me her best friend, it felt like a medal to my chest. But when she said, "You're like the brother I never had," I smiled and said, "Yeah, always," even though something in my chest cracked like thin ice. We texted constantly, finished each other's sentences. She cried on my shoulder after breakups. Every time she'd say, "Why can't all guys be like you?" It took everything in me not to scream. They could be, if you just looked at me. But I didn't. I stayed quiet. The good friend. The safe harbor. The constant. College blurred by in caffeine and deadlines. After graduation, we both ended up in Denver, because of course we did. We couldn't imagine not living 5 blocks apart. I worked as a UX designer at a small startup. She became a copywriter for some digital agency that specialized in making soda sound meaningful. We'd meet every Friday at a cafe that smelled like cinnamon and second chances. She'd talk about her chaotic coworkers, her failed Tinder dates. I'd nod and laugh and give advice like an emotional mechanic fixing engines I'd never get to drive. There were nights we'd end up on my couch, her head on my shoulder, watching movies. She'd mumble, "You're my favorite person, Liam." And I'd whisper, "You too, Chloe." Because that's what brothers do, right? They whisper love like it's platonic oxygen. I told myself I was fine, that being needed was enough, that proximity was love in disguise. But deep down, I was living on breadcrumbs of attention, calling it a feast. Then, last spring, everything shifted. I met Sarah Jensen at my friend David's birthday. From the second she said, "You're standing on my purse, stranger," with that half smile like she'd caught me trespassing, I knew my script was about to change. Sarah was grounded where Chloe was restless, calm where Chloe was chaos. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to earn someone's interest. It was just there, effortless. We talked for hours that night about work, travel, childhood weirdness. When she laughed, she leaned forward, like she actually wanted to catch the sound coming out of my mouth. I walked her to her car, and she said, "If you're this funny sober, you owe me a coffee sometime." I said, "Name the place." She said, "Surprise me." And I swear the air around us felt like a reset button. Our first date was at this plant-filled cafe on Pearl Street where they serve coffee strong enough to fix bad decisions. She listened. Really listened. Like every word mattered. When I told her about my design job, she said, "So, you make confusion look pretty." I laughed, basically. She said, "Then we're opposites." I make chaos sound smart. That's when I realized how easy it could be to connect when it isn't tangled in old debts of affection. After a few weeks of dates, late-night texts, and slow mornings, Sarah became a quiet constant. Not a storm, not a rescue, just peace. I didn't know peace could be so intoxicating. I told Chloe about Sarah one night over tacos, expecting excitement. Instead, her eyes flickered like someone had dimmed the room. She said, "Wow, that's fast." I shrugged, "Yeah, but it feels right." And she said, "Good for you," in that voice people use when they're saying something else entirely. She started asking weirdly specific questions. Is she funny? What does she look like? Do you really like her, or is this a rebound? I laughed it off, thinking she was just protective. But deep down, something in her tone unsettled me. When I told her Sarah wanted to meet her, Chloe said, "Sure, why not," and changed the subject. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. The day of the brunch came, a bright Saturday morning, the kind where Denver pretends it's California for 5 minutes. I was more nervous than I wanted to admit. Chloe arrived first, in a yellow dress that looked like sunlight bottled. She hugged me a little too long, saying, "There's my favorite guy." I laughed, not for long. "Someone's about to challenge your title." She smiled tight and said, "We'll see." Sarah showed up a few minutes later, wearing denim and confidence. She shook Chloe's hand and said, "I've heard so much about you." Chloe replied, "I bet you have," with a smile sharp enough to slice through politeness. We sat down and ordered pancakes. The conversation started light, work stories, travel dreams, harmless jokes. But underneath, there was a current, subtle but strong. Chloe kept steering things back to old memories. Remember when we drove to Lake Tahoe and got lost? Remember how we used to cook together every Sunday? Remember when you said we'd always have each other? Sarah just smiled, patient, graceful, like someone watching a play she already knew the ending of. I felt torn in half. Part of me proud of how natural Sarah was, part of me uneasy at how territorial Chloe sounded. At one point, Chloe leaned over and said, "Liam, tell her about the time we crashed that wedding." Sarah laughed. "You crashed a wedding?" Chloe said, "Yeah, we were unstoppable." And the word we hung in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. I tried to diffuse it with humor, we were dumb college kids. But Chloe just looked at me and said softly, "We were happy." And I swear Sarah caught it. That flicker of something unspoken, because her smile faltered for the first time. The rest of brunch blurred. I paid. Everyone smiled, but the air was heavier than syrup. When Sarah excused herself to take a call outside, Chloe leaned in and said, "She's nice." I said, "She is." Chloe added, "A little perfect. Though." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged. "Nothing. Just, you usually go for chaos, not spreadsheets." I forced a laugh. "Maybe I'm growing up." She looked at me like that was the saddest punchline she'd ever heard. When Sarah came back, Chloe stood and hugged her goodbye with a too-sweet smile. "It was great meeting you." Sarah said, "You, too." As we walked out, Chloe whispered, "Don't disappear on me, okay?" I said, "I'm not disappearing. I'm just living." She said, "Same thing, lately." Then smiled and walked away before I could answer. That night, Sarah and I cooked dinner at my place. She was quiet for a while before asking, "How long have you and Chloe been this close?" I sighed, "Forever, I guess." She said, "You know, she still thinks she's the center of your orbit, right?" I said, "It's not like that." She smiled sadly. "Not for you, maybe." I didn't know how to respond, because part of me already knew she was right. Over the next week, Chloe started texting more, calling at odd hours, sending memes about friendship, missing our talks. Every time I tried to pull back, she'd reel me in with nostalgia. Sarah noticed, of course, she's too smart not to, and I felt torn between loyalty and guilt, between past and future. One evening, after a long day, I found Chloe waiting outside my building with takeout, smiling like nothing had changed. "Thought we could have our old movie night," she said. I hesitated, because inside, Sarah was waiting with wine and a new recipe. I said, "I can't tonight, Chloe. I already have plans." She blinked. "Oh. You have plans?" I said, "Yeah." She laughed. "Wow, you really are gone, huh? I said, I'm not gone. I'm just trying to balance things. She said, balance is boring. I said, maybe boring's what I need. Her face twisted into something I'd never seen. Not anger exactly, but disbelief, like she couldn't fathom a world where she wasn't my priority. She handed me the takeout and said, for when you get tired of perfect, then walked off before I could say a word. I stood there under the buzzing street light, holding 2 paper bags of cooling noodles, realizing that for the first time in years, I hadn't chased after her. That night, I told Sarah everything. The years of friendship, the brother line, the confusion. She just listened, then said, you deserve to be someone's choice, not someone's safety net. I swear that sentence rewired something in my brain. The next morning, Chloe texted, can we talk? I stared at it for a long time before typing, not tonight. She replied, since when do you say no to me? And I didn't answer, because maybe that was the whole problem. I never had. For days, the silence between us stretched. I thought maybe that was it. The quiet death of whatever weird orbit we'd built. But then she showed up again, smiling too bright, saying, I'm happy for you, really. She hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe, whispering, don't forget me, okay? And I said, never, sis. The word came out steady, final, like a door clicking shut at last. Though neither of us realized yet just how much it would echo. After that brunch, something between Chloe and me cracked like glass under slow pressure. You couldn't see the break, but you could feel the edges. It started with harmless texts, miss you. We never hang out anymore. I answered out of habit, because that's what you do when someone once called you their favorite person. But soon it was late-night calls, inside jokes resurfacing, and comments about Sarah wrapped in sugar but sharp underneath, she seems organized. Or, so this is the girl who stole my brother. Sarah noticed, of course, she's too smart not to. But she stayed calm, only saying, you don't owe anyone the version of yourself that kept you small. I tried to believe that, but part of me still flinched every time Chloe's name lit up my phone. One Friday, she called, crying. Can you come over? I went, because old reflexes die slower than love. But when I got there, she wasn't crying, just lonely. She smiled through tears that weren't there and said, I hate when you're too busy for me. I said, I'm not too busy. I'm just not yours. She froze, like the words had never dared leave my mouth before. We watched a movie in silence, and halfway through she whispered, remember when it was just us? I said, yeah, but it isn't anymore. She said, you changed. And I said, maybe I finally did. The next days, she went radio silent, except for Instagram stories with captions like, funny how people move on, and some promises mean nothing. I felt the guilt crawl up, even though I'd done nothing wrong. Sarah told me, she's not losing a friend, she's losing control. That sentence sat heavy in my chest, because it sounded exactly right. Then came David's birthday, the same bar where I'd met Sarah months before. Chloe showed up uninvited, smiling like she owned the room. Liam, she shouted, wrapping me in a hug too tight. Didn't know you'd be here. I said, it's David's birthday. She smirked. And you brought your +1? Throwing a glance at Sarah sharp enough to cut glass. The night spiraled fast, Chloe drinking too much, retelling old stories about our adventures and calling me my brother, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah stood beside me, calm but stiff. When Chloe toasted to the people who never leave, Sarah's hand slipped out of mine. I tried to take Chloe outside, but she laughed. Oh, relax. Can I joke with my best friend? I said, you're not joking. You're crossing lines. She said, you didn't mind the lines before. And there it was, truth wrapped in venom. I stepped outside to breathe, and Sarah followed, eyes bright but cold. She told me you two almost happened once. Is that true? I said, no, we never did. She said, but you wanted to. I didn't answer, because silence was safer than the wrong kind of honesty. Sarah shook her head. You can't build something new while someone else is still living in the ruins. She left before I could speak. I went back inside to find Chloe on the small stage near the bar, mic in hand, tipsy and glowing like a warning flare. You know what's funny? She told the crowd. When your best friend gets a girlfriend and suddenly you're the crazy one. People laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a bit, but my heart stopped. I pushed through the crowd and said, Chloe, get down. She grinned. Why? Embarrassed? I said, this isn't you. She said, maybe it always was. She dropped the mic and stormed past me, muttering, have fun with your perfect girl. I just stood there, surrounded by strangers pretending not to stare. Outside, the air was cold, and the city sounded too alive for how hollow I felt. Sarah texted, I'm going home. I replied, I'll call tomorrow. But she didn't answer. That night, I sat on my couch scrolling through years of photos of Chloe and me, concerts, beaches, birthdays, realizing how long I'd been orbiting someone who never planned to land. The next morning, Chloe texted, sorry if I went too far. I wrote back, you didn't go too far. You went somewhere I can't follow. She replied, you'll miss me. I said, I already did years ago. Then I turned off my phone, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like peace trying to be born in a room that had finally been cleared of ghosts. 3 weeks passed before I saw Chloe again, and by then, the air between us had turned into something heavy enough to choke on. Sarah and I were trying to move forward. Dinners, laughter, quiet mornings. But there was always a ghost at the table, a ghost with brown eyes and perfect timing. Chloe sent me messages that started normal and ended strange. Hope you're doing okay. I miss us. Remember when we didn't need anyone else? I didn't reply, because every word felt like a hook, and I was tired of bleeding for nostalgia. One night she showed up outside my apartment unannounced. Hair wet from the rain, mascara smudged like war paint, clutching a takeout bag like it was a peace offering. Can we talk? She said, voice trembling just enough to sound human again. I hesitated, but stepped aside, because I always did. She walked in, dripping heartbreak on my rug, smelling like the past and bad timing. You've been avoiding me, she said, setting the food down. I just wanted to see you. I said, Chloe, you didn't want to see me. You wanted to make sure I still see you. She flinched, because the truth always lands like a slap. She paced my living room, eyes wild. You replaced me. I said, I didn't replace you. I grew up. She shouted, you don't just outgrow people. I said, no, but you outgrow versions of yourself that depend on being someone else's. Favorite. Her voice cracked. So what am I now? I said, someone I used to love the wrong way. She froze, staring at me like she was seeing a stranger. You loved me, she whispered. I said, yeah, but not enough to keep losing myself. For a moment, everything was silent except the rain tapping the windows like it wanted to clap for finally being honest. She sat down, trembling. I thought we'd always be us. I said, we are, just not the way you want anymore. She started crying. Ugly, loud, raw. The kind of crying that sounds like confession. I handed her a tissue, not out of pity, but habit. Because that's what I'd always done. Fix, comfort, absorb. She looked at me through tears. You really love her? I said, yes. She said, is she better than me? I said, she's not competing with you, Chloe. She just loves me without trying to own me. She laughed bitterly. Guess I was always the villain in your story. I said, no, you were just human. So was I. We both stayed too long in a friendship that wasn't one anymore. Then she stood, voice small again. I don't know how to be without you. I said, "You'll learn." "We both will." She nodded like she hated the sound of acceptance. When she finally left, she hugged me once too long and whispered, "Goodbye, brother." And this time, I didn't correct her. I just whispered, "Goodbye, sister." Because maybe the only way to let go is to bury the ghost with the name it gave itself. After that night, I didn't hear from her for months. Not a text, not a sighting, just silence. For the first time in years, it didn't hurt. It just existed. Sarah stayed patient, kind, real. One evening while cooking dinner, she said, "Do you still think about her?" I said, "Sometimes, but it's more like remembering who I was, not who she is." She smiled. "That's what healing sounds like." I laughed. "Then it's the loudest thing I've ever heard." Weeks later, while scrolling online, I stumbled on one of Chloe's new posts. A photo of her hiking, smiling genuinely, captioned, "Some people aren't chapters, they're lessons." I didn't feel anger, just a strange gratitude that maybe she finally found herself somewhere that didn't require me. Life went on quietly after that, which is the kind of peace you only notice once you've lived inside chaos. Sarah and I moved in together the next spring. Small apartment, too many plants, not enough storage, but it felt like home. The kind that doesn't depend on fixing anyone. Sometimes I'd walk past the old cafe where Chloe and I used to sit for hours, and I'd see other pairs laughing over coffee, and I'd smile, because someone else was learning what I already knew, that love dressed as friendship can still leave bruises when you hug it too hard. Months later, out of nowhere, I got one last text from Chloe. Just 5 words, "Thank you for growing up." I typed back, "Thank you for letting me." And that was it. The end of a story that should have ended years ago, but needed time to understand itself. People ask if we ever became friends again. And the answer is no. Because some bridges don't need rebuilding. They need to stay gone so you remember why you crossed the river in the first place. Now when I think of her, I don't feel ache. I feel distance. Like watching lightning miles away. Beautiful, untouchable, dangerous, only if you forget how far you've come. Sometimes Sarah teases me when I zone out. "Hey, Earth to Liam." I smile. "Just visiting old ghosts." And she says, "Tell them they don't pay rent anymore." And we laugh, because maybe that's all healing really is. Laughing at the echoes instead of living in them. If you ask me how it feels now, after all of it, the years of being the brother, the confessions that never happened, the heartbreak disguised as loyalty, I'll tell you it feels like breathing after years underwater. Because the truth is, Chloe didn't break me. She revealed the cracks I kept pretending weren't there. And Sarah didn't save me. She just handed me a mirror and said, "You can step out now." And I did. And maybe that's the real ending. Not the fireworks, not the revenge, not the dramatic speech, just peace, quiet, and a name I can finally say without flinching. So yeah, she'll always be part of my story. But now when I think of her, I don't think of love or loss or what if. I just think she's my sister. And this time, it doesn't hurt to mean it. What would you have done in my shoes?